Our story began on September 21st, 1825, in Langen, Austria, when twins were born to a farmer, Anton Fanner. The two boys were baptized, Johannes and Wendelin. The first became a minor, and the other is the center of our story. The small Wendelin, with his curly red hair, mischievous, grew like all of us in a happy family environment. But this happiness was broken by his mother's death. For what is a home without a mother? When he became 7 years of age, Wendelin began his primary school. He was a clever boy, but like many other boys, he liked to play too much and did not always do his schoolwork properly. His tests were not as positive as the family had hoped. He spent too much energy wrestling and making himself respected by the bigger boys. In his memoirs, he wrote later, I quote, "When a bigger, older fellow taunted me and called me a carrot top, I was just angry because I could not do anything about it. But if my persecutor was only a head taller than I would tackle him and throw him before he even knew what had happened. In time, even the bigger fellows learned to respect me and to be more careful of what they would say about me. With time, that playful and aggressive boy became a more serious, matured, reliable, and good young man. And having finished his studies, Wendelin got an exemption for entering the university in Innsbruck, Austria. And later on, he joined the seminary and studied philosophy, also in Innsbruck, and went to Italy with 3 colleagues for training. During the summer in 1846, Wendelin had the conviction that he was called to be a priest. The seed began to grow. He became very obsessed with the idea of working in the vineyard of the Lord. In September then, 1846, he began his studies of theology in the seminary in Brixen. The seed planted by God in his heart was beginning to develop. Father Fanner, then when he was ordained, celebrated his first Mass in his home village in Langen, and he was appointed, as usual, in a parish of Hasselstauden. In spring of 1862, Fanner traveled to Rome, and a new life of contemplation, of silence, and of love of God was discovered when he met 2 monks from Belgium. He was filled with admiration and fascinated for the monastic life and decided therein to become a Trappist. On September 8, 1886, on the feast of the Nativity of Mary, Wendelin Fanner announced then his decision to go to the Trappist monastery of Mariannhill in Germany. And he wrote to his family, I quote, "I have begun long long ago, thinking about the step which I am taking. And I know that it is the will of God, and I should become a Trappist monk. I'm doing this with calm deliberation and a clear mind. The call of my master is clear and unmistakable. I realize that monastic life will require courage and sacrifice. Close quote. Then on the 8th of October, 1863, Fana was then clothed and accepted formally into the Trappist order. And then he received a new name of Francis. On November 21st, 1864, he made his vows as a Trappist. And soon he was chosen to be the assistant to the prior. And at one time, he even held the important office of being novice master. And all this made him feel the joy and fullness of life completely given to God. Then Pope Pius IX asked for help to rebuild the ruins of a church and monastery of Trefontane near Rome in Italy. Francis Fana was entrusted to this work, and he left then for Rome. In June 1867, Fana left Trefontane in Rome and was sent to Hungary to find a suitable place for a new monastery. There he followed the suggestion of a Greek businessman who owned property in Bosnia. Francis Fana found what he looked for in a little town of Banja Luka, in a part of Hungary that now belongs to Yugoslavia. And there, the foundation of Maria Sten met with many problems, for this part of the country was seized by the Turks under Mohammed II. He then became suspicious that this was an enemy fortress going up, put by foreigners. The abbots and the priors of the Trappist order met in Serfont, France in 1879 for their general chapter. Upon his arrival there, Fana was summoned to the office of the Vicar General, where he was told, "Father Fana, we have decided to raise Maria Sten to the rank of an abbey and to make you the abbot." Hence, from that time, Franz Fana is referred to as the abbot. A surge of joy swept through his heart. His beloved Maria Sten was to become crowned with the greatest honor that could be granted to a religious community. And during the meeting of the General Chapter, the course of events changed when a South African bishop by name of Rickards asked the strictly contemplative monks for a dozen handymen for his missions in the Cape of Good Hope. The situation in the conference room was most embarrassing. How could they make it clear to the missionary bishop that contemplative monks like the Trappists had other tasks than active pastoral work? let alone mission work. Yeah. But the Bishop Rickard persisted. He believed that even contemplative monks could work in the missions through the example of their work, prayer, and silence. We read and we are told that there was indeed dead silence in the room. None of the abbots were ready to make an offer. They knew their people and the rules of the order. Then the prior of the Turkish monastery broke the silence. He stood up, his eyes blazing, and said, "If no one goes, I will go." This declaration, which came as such a shock in the chapter room, was to Fana the answer to the call from God, or coming to him through the missionary bishop from South Africa. It was by no means the first time, as we recall, that Fana had the idea of going abroad as a missionary. In firm tones, the prior of Mariannhill declared his spontaneous readiness to go to South Africa. So on July 28, 1880, Father Francis and his companions set foot on the African soil at Port Elizabeth. And with it, a new life began for Father Francis. Also, a new page in the history of the church in South Africa was being written. The group of 30 men went to Blue Diff on the Sunday River. They were provided with several riding horses and a sort of a bus. From the railway station, the monks walked to their final destination, Dunbrody, singing and praying like pious troopers. There stood a crude corrugated iron structure standing in the midst of thick bramble and cactus plants. That was to be their home. For the following 9 months, the order of the day for these courageous men was to clear the bush. And for 2 years, these strong and uncomplaining men in white and brown toiled with pick and shovel under the merciless African sun, prayed, fasted, and suffered. The little that ripened was carried off by the wild birds and monkeys, and in the meantime, they often did not have enough food to sustain their health. One day, Bishop Rickards, with tears in his eyes, told them that he had no more money. And so he wrote, Papa Francis, since even the Jesuits have worked so hard there and spent so much time and money, I am now convinced that it is impossible to exist in Dunbrody. It does not support life now and never will. So while he was in Europe, Francis received the word that Bishop Jolivet of Natal had permitted them to work in his territory. And upon receiving this news, he dispatched the following brief order to the assistant whom he had left in charge in Dunbrody while he was overseas, and that was Father Joseph Bigner. Leave your land, was the command from Francis Fana. And this order was received with great joy by the little community of Dunbrody in August 1882. They immediately prepared to leave for Natal, the first group leaving in November and the rest following in December. And here begins the story of Mariannhill. The mobile abbey walked in search of the promised land. The monks and their heavy ox wagons caused quite a sensation among the locals who had never seen anything like this before. The head boy who was leading the ox wagon, Edward Shalela, was there when the monks arrived. He guided the leading oxen to the caravan, to the big sycamore tree near where the farm buildings were later to stand. Father Francis gave the order to turn left on the high ground. And there the disaster happened. The stubborn ox turned right by mistake and went straight into a patch of marshy ground. There was no question of getting the wagons out straight away. So there and then, the prior made up his mind, unload, we will stay here. And this is where we will build our monastery. It is God's will. The next question was, what will this new monastery be called? And so after a long silence, Father Francis declared, Mariannhill. We will call it Mariannhill. And with these words, Father Francis dedicated the new mission settlement to the Blessed Virgin Mary and to her mother, Good St. Anne, to each of whom he had great devotion. At that moment, he did not foresee that the name he had selected would one day designate a distinct geographical territory in the mission world, and also a new missionary society, which would in the not too distant future become known throughout the world for its missionary zeal and accomplishment. The life in Mariannhill was dedicated to building the monastery and to bring as many locals as possible to our farm, Francis declared. The monks offered their influence and their teaching of the locals with the spirit of work and prayer, commonly known as ora et labora. Father Francis, bearing in mind the need for evangelization, said, preaching Christ to people seeking God is more important than the obligation to be silent. 3 years later, he had 150 people already. Then, years after the foundation, there were more than 250. Mariannhill became the biggest and most famous Trappist monastery of the time. How this could be possible, he himself explains. Here, there are people of every class. We have officers, doctors, engineers, men of letters, barons, even generals. We have people with every kind of knowledge, people who made a great name in the world, who owned estates and houses and have given them up. Francis went from time to time then back to Europe to collect funds and personnel, naturally. both clerical and lay. He preached in public squares in the big cities, exposing the real problems of the missions. His humor was his magnetic personality that got for his new foundation the admiration and help of many benefactors. Immediately, Franz Farner realized the need for educating the locals. And one of Farner's most important helpers in this first missionary contact with the Zulus was a young man who had come from Lesotho, Benjamin Makaba. He taught the Zulu language to the monks, naturally, which they needed to do, and ran the first school at Mariannhill together with David Bryant, later who became also a priest, and an authority on anthropology of the region and on Zulu traditions. Among the first black children who came to school here at Mariannhill was one who later became Dr. Edward Mula Mganga, ordained priest in Rome around the turn of the century, a pioneer of the Missionaries of Mariannhill. And at Christmas in 1884, the first Bantu were baptized at Mariannhill just 2 years after the arrival of the monks. The issue of the school that Franz Farner built here in Mariannhill, it was to be a multiracial school. And he said himself, I cannot bear discrimination between races of men as if God valued them according to the color of their skin. I believe I learned to become angry about it when I was still a child, and my schoolmates were always teasing me about my red hairs. From the start, their father refused to separate whites from blacks. It was taken for granted that the school at Mariannhill, commonly known today as St. Francis College, would be mixed with African and European children. And he himself said, all the boys in our establishment receive bed, board, and tuition, whether they are pagans, Mohammedans, Protestants, or Catholics, white or colored, English, German, Italian, Indian, or the word native, which was used in those days. They sleep side by side, eat at the same table, get the same food, and sit on the same benches. On April 11, 1885, the election of a new abbot took place in Mariannhill under the chairmanship of the Bishop of Natal. No one was surprised, therefore, that all the votes of the chapter were cast for Franz Farner. 3 years after the monks had arrived, on 26th and 27th of December 1885, the abbot was consecrated, and the abbot's motto was mounted clearly above the entrance: run so that you may win the prize. Abbot Francis Farner believed also that in order to succeed, he would need the help of the sisters. After Francis's 2 schools, one for boys and one for girls, grew and flourished, in both schools, the number of pupils soon began to overflow, the accommodation with the girls outnumbering the boys. But Francis knew that he would have to solve that problem quickly because of the education of the girls. he decided that the only solution was getting nuns for the work. He sent out an appeal for volunteers to Europe, and 5 zealous lay women responded. And on the 8th of December 1888, the new sisters made their first vows. In 1902, Abbot Francis wrote to a friend in Austria, "There is nothing anywhere in the world like these Red Sisters. There are now 300 of them, and they are well adapted to teaching and working in the fields. You might call them an agricultural order. They are working now in, at that time was called German East Africa, which is Tanzania. And they were also in the Congo, which is today known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. They were in Rhodesia at that time and called today Zimbabwe. They were in the Cape and in Natal. There are about 80 novices in the new novitiate house in Holland. In 1906, the Red Sisters, now called the Missionary Sisters of the Precious Blood, were approved by Rome. Another great achievement for the old abbot. Mariannhill began to spread, and it is said that Franz Farner believed that it was the will of Pope Pius IX that the Trappists should go to Africa for missionary work. The abbot wanted to be faithful and obedient to the command of Jesus, go and preach the gospel to all peoples. And for this reason, he said, our mission field is a part of Christ's kingdom that has no boundaries. Until God willed that his efforts should be brought to an end, Abbot Francis worked unceasingly for the development and expansion of the mission. Such was his missionary zeal that when he was in Emmaus, confined and in exile, hearing that Cecil Rhodes was nearby in Coxted, he jumped on his horse to meet him. Rhodes was very surprised when the stubborn and old man introduced himself as an abbot and the founder of Mariannhill. Rhodes had heard about the missionary pioneer and was delighted to meet him in person. Farner then received the assurance that 1,000 acres of land in Mashonaland would be made available for missionary purposes. August the 16th, 1895, Father Hyacinth was able to ride to Mashonaland, 2,000 kilometers from Mariannhill. In 1897, the two fathers founded the station then called Noi-Kolon in western Usambara Mountains. And here also expansion took place when a Zulu chief asked for a local school on the Pholela River. Chief Sakayedwa Farner felt he had no choice but to respond to this request. Reichenau, was then founded, but it was only the beginning of the expansion. Other stations soon followed along the same route. Einsiedeln in Richmond, Mariannhill in Ikobo, Kevela in Donnybrook, Lutz, Santocow, St. Michael's, which Bishop Jolivet offered to the Trappists when they arrived here, Maria Rachis in Zululand, Mariannhill up in Maluti, which in the course of years grew to be a very large independent missions with schools, hospitals, and farms. Abbot Francis always saw the need and the necessity of the missionary activities of the monks outside the farm. He foresaw that there might be some conflict between the role of monks and missionaries, but that did not stop him from spreading further and further, because, he said himself, if Christ is being preached, no matter by whom, then all is well. The monastery of Mariannhill and the monks became the center of extensive mission work to the Africans. Father wrote himself, "The last thing I wanted was an order of penitence like the Carthusians." I wanted a missionary congregation. I wanted the sisters to go into the native huts, friendly, happy, and cheerful. You get nowhere with the Africans, he said, by being gloomy, rude, sad, or sullen. The spirit I want to see impressed on my sisters is one of friendliness and cheerfulness, for the African loves happiness. Father was very well aware of the conflict between contemplative and missionary life. He recognized the contradiction of ideals, as often is referred to as Mariannhill, between two ideals. It was always a question, what is the best to do, to be a contemplative congregation locked in, or a missionary congregation going out? Yeah. In May 1890, a document was received from Mariannhill, from the Vicar General of the Trappist Order, in which it was stated that Abbot Francis was being accused under serious charges. Most of them originated from the very same man who had brought them to South Africa, Bishop Rickards, a man born for being in conflicts with others. And these were the three charges that were laid against Abbot Francis. One, that Abbot Francis had squandered funds which were meant for the missions by erecting useless and luxurious buildings. Two, that by doing so, Abbot Francis deprived the missionaries of their rightful support and neglected their well-being. Three, that Abbot Francis had been remiss in safeguarding the spiritual and moral life of the community and that the spiritual care of the sisters was also being neglected. There you are. The chapter council of Mariannhill therefore resolved to fight these slanderous charges against their beloved leader and to clear him of the stigma that had been so unjustly imprinted upon him. The answer to the Vicar General, in which Abbot Francis had no part, denied the accusations in every detail. In January 1892, Abbot Francis returned to Mariannhill again from Europe, accompanied at this time by the canonical visitor of the order, Abbot Strank, a stern and severe disciplinarian. The community was one day informed that Abbot Francis had been summarily suspended from his office. He was given strict order to refrain himself completely from any connection with monastery affairs and forbidden to communicate with any father, brother, or sister. And according to canonical regulations, religious novices are not to be used and employed outside the monastery presence. And every superior who does not comply with these regulations is subject to suspension. He was forced to violate the letter of the law, since at the time the mission was established, it so happened that only those who were novices could speak the native language, and there were not enough professed monks to take care of all the mission stations. Abbot Francis humbly submitted to this order of suspension and retired to the mission station at Lutz, from where he then, it is written, he wrote to Brother Nivard, his right hand, "Today is the feast of the finding of the true cross. I too have found a particle of that cross. I will embrace it and kiss it, and I will be drawn up to the Father in heaven. In my bosom rests the hope that my Redeemer still lives." The situation and the Spirit revealed the majestic grandeur and nobility of Abbot Francis. He accepted his sufferings as a test, without hatred but with love. When Abbot Francis, a year later, when the suspension was over, he did not, as was expected, return to Mariannhill. On April the 25th, 1894, a new abbot was consecrated. Abbot Francis Fana humbly submitted to this order of suspension and retired to the mission station of Lutz, from where he wrote then to Brother Nivard, "Today is the feast of the finding of the true cross. I too have found a particle of that cross. I will embrace it, kiss it. I will be drawn up to the Father in heaven. In my bosom rests the hope that my Redeemer still lives." And so the situation and this spirit revealed the majestic grandeur and nobility of Abbot Francis. He accepted his sufferings as a test, without hatred, but with love. When Abbot Francis's year of formal suspension was over, he did not, as was expected, return to Mariannhill. And so they needed somebody to succeed him. And so on April the 25th, 1894, a new abbot was consecrated as the second abbot of Mariannhill. One day earlier, Father drove out from Lutz in an ox wagon, and on the Chimpas Neck mountain, a 2.5-hour drive, there he began a new foundation, which then was called Emmaus. He began to build the new mission, to prepare the roads, to dig a channel to bring water to the mission. He had enough energy to build stone by stone, or to make stations of the cross up on the hill. So under Francis's direction, Emmaus grew into an independent, viable, modern station. In this farm of his in Emmaus, produced also cheese. Visitors came from all over to see the gray-haired abbot and to chat with the man who had achieved so much and was now passing the evening of his life in silence and simplicity. They came also to buy the famous cheese that was produced there and enjoy its delicacy and flavor. In the writings of Abbot Francis himself, we find many interesting stories which will not be worth going through in this. When Abbot Francis reached his 80th birthday in 1905, he was forced to modify the austerity and rigor of his daily routine. He now began to suffer more and more from severe attacks of arthritis. His condition grew worse, and he suffered more and more pains. Soon he was unable to say Mass without being supported. So during the last 2 or 3 years of his life, he was no longer able to celebrate Holy Mass. Though this deprivation was another great cross, he accepted again this cross without complaint. He continued to rise at 4:30 in the morning, attended Holy Mass offered by another father, received Holy Communion. Father Joseph Bigner, a friend and a companion of the abbot, he wrote, "On Friday, May 14, 1909, I had his confession and gave him general absolution and extreme unction. On the following morning, he received Holy Viaticum with great humility and devotion. From that day till his death, he spoke less as his strength slowly ebbed. I gave him Holy Communion every morning for the last time on Sunday, the 23rd of May. That same day, his agony had began. Father Francis died with a burning candle in his hand at 2 a.m. on Monday, the 24th of May, 1909. And the last word he spoke was light. He died on the day the church celebrates the feast of Mary, Help of Christians. The Mother of God loved him into heaven on her feast. He who loved Mary, the Mother of God, with all his soul and had dedicated his great foundation of Mariannhill to Mary. Where will Abbot Francis be buried? Was the question there. The funeral took place on May the 27th. He was buried here in Mariannhill Cemetery, and there and here the mortal remains of this brave lion rest. Fana did not live to see Mariannhill grow and develop. Fana can only see Mariannhill what it is today, with a number of local vocations that have come up, the first being ordained in 1973, the first local Mariannhill missionary, the very same person who speaks and talks about the history of Mariannhill, Paul Mandla Khumalo. Pope Pius took the matter of Mariannhill into his own hands and brought about a solution. He separated the Mariannhill missionary fathers and brothers from the Trappist order, making them a distinct and entirely separate missionary congregation with their own constitutions, their rule of life, and the habit that is presently used. The black cincture, the black cassock, and the red cincture. The work of the gospel, which, thanks to Abbot Francis, was started over 125 years ago in these African lands, is still left to complete. Mariannhill missionaries have meanwhile spread in the new parts of Africa, like Zambia, East Africa, Kenya. They've also gone again to South America, now currently a new foundation in Colombia. And Mariannhill missionaries feel themselves part of God's kingdom and consider as their own the living idea of Franz Fana. Our mission field is a part of Christ's kingdom, and that has no boundaries.